it is quite appropriate for us to be learning Pirkei Avos because this is the time of the year that everybody studies Pirkei Avos. On the Shabbases between Pesach and Shavuos, or according to other traditions from Pesach all the way until Rosh Hashanah. But either way, this is the time of the year that we tend to give a little bit more attention to Pirkei Avos. So it's appropriate for us to be learning Pirkei Avos as we've been doing already for some time, but it kind of has a little bit of extra impetus at this time of the year. The Mishnah that we're going to learn today, we're in the 3rd chapter, and we're up to the 4th Mishnah. The Mishnah we're going to learn today is short in text. That does not necessarily mean that it is short of ideas or information. In fact, you're going to see that there's quite a lot to delve into over here. But before we can begin today's Mishnah, as is often the case, you need to have context. So just briefly, we need to go back for a moment and remind ourselves of what the previous Mishnah spoke about. So that would be the 3rd Mishnah of the 3rd chapter of Pirkei Avos. Once we appreciate where we're coming from, it helps us better to appreciate where we are in the context. And not only in the context just of these 2 Mishnahs, but actually the whole theme of this section of Pirkei Avos. Now, one of the things that you're going to see as a theme, it's a theme that we're focused on right now, and it is a theme that comes back in the 6th chapter. It's a strong theme in Pirkei Avos, is the value and the importance of Torah study. Now that's interesting, because if you remember, Pirkei Avos is mili de chasidusa. That means that it's over and above the requirement of the law. There's the requirement of the law of things that you have to do. And Pirkei Avos comes along to tell you what you go beyond what you have to do. So you would assume that Torah study is something you have to do, and that would be correct. However, when Pirkei Avos looks at Torah study, there are 2 things that immediately come to mind. The first is that in addition to the degree of Torah study which you are required to do, automatically you should be aware of the fact that there is further Torah study that you should do even once you've executed your requirement. Once you've discharged your responsibility, there's even more Torah learning that you're supposed to do. There's a second message over here as well, which is quite an important message. And the second message is, if you want to know mili de chasidusa, if you want to know what it is to be an individual who's a mensch, because that's effectively what it is. Pirkei Avos tells us about how to be a good human being, how to behave, how to have an ethical compass. So if you want to have any of that, then you need to learn Torah. And not just learn Torah, but learn much Torah. As we already saw Hillel say, Marbe Torah. That was the expression that he used in the previous chapter. He said when it comes to Torah learning, it's not good enough just to learn. The goal is to learn a tremendous amount of Torah. And it's exactly that theme that we're dealing with right now. So as a quick word of revision, the previous Mishnah that we studied was attributed to Rabbi Shimon. And we came to understand that Rabbi Shimon is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a very famous person. Actually, at this time of the year, kind of shines a little bit more because we're coming up for Lag BaOmer, which is his Yortzeit. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was one of those unique individuals who we are told, Toirasoi Umnosoi. His full-time occupation, his profession, was learning Torah. So there were other sages who, most of the sages actually at the time, they learned Torah and even headed up great yeshivas, and on the side, they also had some kind of an income. By the labor of their hands, that was the favored way of earning an income, that you actually worked physically. You physically worked in order to earn an income. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he was unique. Torasoi umnosei, his full-time occupation was learning Torah and nothing else. So much so to the extent that he didn't even have to stop to daven. Something which is difficult for us to imagine, but that's how it was. He was so caught up in his learning, and he learned with such a fervor and with such an intensity and so focused that he did not have to stop to daven. So it's not surprising then that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would be somebody who tells us that you have to learn Torah at every available opportunity. And that was the previous Mishnah. The previous Mishnah was Rabbi Shimon telling us that even when you sit at the table and you're having a meal, the average person says, listen, I'm happy to learn Torah when it's time to learn Torah, but now we're eating. Now we're eating dinner or whatever it is. Why is this a time to be learning Torah? Comes along Rabbi Shimon and he says, not only should you learn Torah while you're at the dinner table as well, but he was quite radical. He went so far as to say, if you do, then your dinner table is a place which is like an altar for God. And if you don't, God forbid, then it's as if you're eating from idolatrous sacrifices. So he made a very broad and powerful statement about the importance of learning Torah, even in casual moments of our lives, even in parav moments of our lives. So that's the theme. The theme that we're dealing with is the importance of learning Torah, even at times where you are not officially obligated to study Torah. Today's Mishnah will pick up on that theme. And we'll discover that the author of today's Mishnah was a contemporary and a colleague of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Now that's important because obviously many of these rabbis lived at similar or the same periods of Jewish history. Many of them overlapped. But certain of them were colleagues. That means to say that they went down the same path. And the rabbi we're going to learn about in this Mishnah was a colleague of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, not only chronologically, not only because they shared certain ideas, but because he also is one of these unique individuals that Torasoi umnosoi, that his full-time occupation was Torah study. So let's meet the rabbi of this Mishnah, Rabbi Chanina ben Chachinoi. Okay, it's a little bit of a tongue twister kind of a name. Rabbi Chanina ben Chachinoi. Who was he? So Rabbi Chanina ben Chachinoi and Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai both went to yeshiva at around about the same time. When I say around about the same time, basically what happened was, in those days, you have to understand, it's very different to how life is for us now. In those days, people often got married very young, sometimes even in their teens, and then they would go off to study. So it's difficult for us to relate to that because in our world, people study first and then they settle down and they get married. And some people stay on in a kollel for a number of years and they continue to study. But when you're talking over here about people who Torasam umnosam, that their full-time occupation was Torah study, you understand that it happened after their wedding as well. There are many people like that. Perhaps the most famous is Rabbi Akiva, who we know left his wife for years and years on end, and then when he eventually came back after having studied in yeshiva, he overheard her saying that she wished he would go and study more. So he went straight back to yeshiva. I'm sure you're familiar with the story. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai got married, and as of course we do, there was a week of Sheva Brachos. And his colleague and friend, Rabbi Chanina ben Chachinoi, wanted to go off to yeshiva, and he got impatient. What's with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai that he's waiting till the end of Sheva Brachos? So what's the delay, We got to go to yeshiva already. So he went ahead. Rabbi Chanina went ahead of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So that already tells you what kind of a personality we're dealing with over here. His absolute involvement with Torah was extreme. He was somebody who, in a certain regard, even outdid Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is always considered as this ultimate personality of Torah study. And off he went, and he went to yeshiva for 13 years, Rabbi Chanina. The story I'm about to tell you is not for sensitive listeners. Okay, so you might want to just mute for a moment. Just turn off the volume for a second, because this is a very difficult story to imagine in our contemporary mindset. Rabbi Chanina goes off to yeshiva for 13 years without seeing his family at all during that period of time, until eventually he gets a message from his wife to say, maybe it's about time you came home to help your daughter to find a shidduch. So he thought that was a compelling argument, Rabbi Chanina, and he decided to come home. He didn't give any forewarning that he was coming, and when he arrived home, he ran into a group of young people, teenagers, and they were talking. And he heard one of them say there was a group of girls, and he heard one of the girls say to one of the other girls, Bas Chachinoi, daughter of Chachinoi. And that's how they addressed her. So then he realized that was his daughter. He didn't recognize his daughter. He hadn't seen her for so long. He didn't recognize his own daughter, if you can imagine that. He walks through the door at home, and his wife is busy doing some household chores. She looks up, sees her husband at the door, got such a fright she had a heart attack and died. So Rabbi Chanina immediately davened, and he said, Master of the universe, here is a woman who was willing to sacrifice for 13 years in order that her husband should go and study Torah with no disturbance. And this is how you reward her? That eventually when I come back home, the first time she sees me, that's it? She dies? And so at that point, Hashem miraculously resurrected his wife, and I guess they lived happily ever after, as they say in the Disney franchise. So it's a fascinating story, and it just tells you the power of the individual, and of course the single-minded focus that he had on the importance of learning Torah. So once you understand the background of who it is that we're talking about, then you can begin to appreciate what it is that he has to say. He's effectively going to address two things. Like I say, this Mishnah is not for sensitive viewers. Not only is the story of Rabbi Hanina and his wife a little bit of a jarring story, but what Rabbi Hanina has to say, when you consider we who live in the 21st century, actually might be just a little bit shocking to us. So what does he say? Rabbi Hanina ben Chachinoi oimer, haneor balayla. A person who keeps themselves awake at night. Okay, that's the expression. Haneor, somebody who stays awake at night. V'hamahalech baderech yichidi, and or a person who walks on a path alone. Now, derech doesn't mean a path like the road inside a city. When he says derech, he means specifically if a person travels between cities. So in other words, you're not in an urban environment. So such a person who goes alone. Okay, so here are the two options. Either it's a person who stays awake at night, or it's a person who goes out, so to speak, on a long journey alone. Or mefane liboy levatola. And such a person then directs their heart, meaning their mind, meaning their intention, levatola, to something of no value, of no consequence. Harezeh mischayev benafshoy. Such a person is responsible for their own life. In other words, they've taken their life into their own hands. So it's pretty harsh, because basically what it means is if you wake up in the middle of the night, maybe you need to be doing something more meaningful. If a person directs their heart towards something which is meaningless, God forbid, they deserve who knows what. So let's first contextualize a little bit of what's going on over here. First of all, what is the common thread between being awake at night and being on the road alone? There has to be a common thread between them. And that's clearly what he's trying to reference and draw our attention to. So what's the connection between the two? One of the principles that we have in Judaism, it's something we speak about a lot, is the principle of being sure that you don't place yourself in danger's way, in harm's way. Okay, it's really important in Judaism. A person is not permitted to put themselves in harm's way. You know, some people are quite philosophical about it, and they use expressions like, if it's my time, it's my time. Not that simple. In fact, just last night we were learning, there's a book called the Ein Yaakov. I don't know if you've ever seen it. So Ein Yaakov is a collection of anecdotes from the Gemara. And it was typically studied, as it is still today, by people who went to work during the day. They didn't have much time to study. They'd come to shul in the evening, and between Mincha and Ma'ariv, they would learn extracts from the Ein Yaakov, which is basically, so to speak, easier segments of the Gemara. So Dafka, last night, we were studying a passage of Ein Yaakov, and the Gemara over there says something which might sound really shocking. The Gemara says that there is a verse in the Tanakh, and the verse tells us that it is sometimes possible for a person to pass away without justice, which the Gemara interprets to mean that it is possible for somebody to pass away before their allotted time. Now, we always say, right? We always say that if somebody passes away, obviously that was their time. But the Gemara says it's not that simple, and there are possible scenarios where a person could pass away before their time. What would be a possible scenario where a person is negligent, reckless, where a person puts themselves in harm's way? You can't turn around and say, if it's my time, it's my time. It doesn't work that way. So there are certain scenarios that are considered harmful, and we're not allowed to put ourselves into those situations. So maybe a classic example would be, the great superstition about not walking underneath a ladder. So as far as Judaism is concerned, there's no superstition about not walking under a ladder. But there is a clear halacha that says you may not walk under a rickety ladder, for obvious reasons, because it's dangerous. It has nothing to do with superstition. It's nothing to do with voodoo. It's just practical. It's dangerous. You don't do that. Likewise, the Gemara talks at length about the idea of a person not spending time, particularly alone, in a ruined building. So some of the sages will tell you that the problem with a ruin is that it attracts the disembodied spirits of who knows who, and they could harm you. And the other is quite simply because a ruin is a dangerous place. Things are unstable, and walls could collapse, and floors could give way, so you don't go there. So as an axiom of Judaism, a person is forbidden to put themselves in harm's way. Now, by the way, that could raise a whole lot of halakhic questions, like are you allowed to bungee jump, and are you allowed to skydive, and are you allowed to have elective surgery? Okay, those are questions that have to be addressed on an individual basis to your local Orthodox rabbi. They're not the purpose of this conversation, but it is important for us to know that that principle exists, that you're not allowed to put yourself in harm's way. So now the question is, harm's way, what exactly is harm's way? So here, Rabbi Chanina immediately identifies two things that affect the average person. Some obviously more frequently, the first more frequently than the second, but they all affect us. These are places which are more inclined to danger, or these are scenarios that are more inclined to danger. What are they? The one is nighttime, and the other is long-distance travel. So we don't have to be rocket scientists to understand long-distance travel. We know the dangers that are related to it. This time of the year, the April death toll on the South African roads is usually quite horrific because there's so much long-distance travel and people go for the long weekends. And there's, so we know exactly long-distance travel is, God forbid, dangerous. We get that, we know that. In fact, during this whole period of lockdown and airlines not flying, so somebody who I know went long distance. They have a place near the coast and they wanted to go there. They didn't want to fly, so they drove. And they told me afterwards that to drive on our roads is more dangerous than to expose yourself to the possibility of coronavirus by flying on a plane. And it's probably not exaggerated. So it's an accepted concept that being out on the road is dangerous, except that you have to remember this is in the Talmudic period. And in the Talmudic period, they didn't have to worry about people who were driving in excess of the speed limit, and they didn't have to worry about trucks that were overtaking on a solid line on the wrong side of the road. So what exactly was the fear about being out on the road? So in those days, the fears were of a different kind. If you're not in an urban environment, as you know from the Tfilas HaDerech, the prayer for travelers, part of what we say is that Hashem should protect us from wild animals. They really had that. I know for us in South Africa, we feel that we only really get to say the Tfilas HaDerech properly if we go into the Kruger Park. Then you know that you're davening to be protected from wild animals. But in those days, it was a real deal. If you were between cities, you were exposed to all kinds of wild animals. You were exposed to armed gangs, bandits, who were often on the road. So that was really the concern that a person had about being on the road alone. So therefore, being on the road outside of a city is automatically considered to be a dangerous environment. That's the second one that he talks about, and the one that we can relate to a little bit better. What's the first one that he talks about? Haneor balayla, being awake at night. It's difficult to believe because we live in a modern world and because we have electricity. So it's difficult to imagine just what a night felt like in the ancient world. Basically, everybody shut down very soon after it got dark. You would daven Ma'ariv, you would learn a little bit of Torah, because the Gemara does tell us in Eruvin that lo ivre laila ela legirsa, the only reason that the night was created was to facilitate us having the opportunity to learn Torah. So you learned a little bit of Torah and then you went to sleep. Not like us. It's completely uncommon what we're doing. It's a new lifestyle where you can stay up for many hours after it gets dark. So at night, because it was so dark, it was also considered a dangerous time. People were more susceptible to robbery or to attack, and even to spiritual beings, the mazikin, the spiritual entities. The Gemara in Brachos goes into a lot of detail about this. So the mazikin, the entities that can cause spiritual damage in the world, they have, so to speak, free reign at night. So these are the two areas that Rabbi Chanina identifies as being naturally dangerous environments. To be up at night or to be out on the road. And as far as Rabbi Chanina is concerned, these are scenarios where a person needs more protection than usual. So if you're sleeping, you're sleeping. Nobody could fault you for that. In fact, as far as the Torah is concerned, you're supposed to sleep. The Rambam was in favor of sleeping for 8 hours a night. It's interesting because there's a fair amount of modern research that corroborates the Rambam's approach that you should sleep for 8 hours at night. So at night, if you're tired and you have to sleep, nobody's going to fault you for that. Nobody's going to hold it against you. You have to sleep. That's the way Hashem designed human beings. You need to refresh and rejuvenate. That's what you got to do. In fact, sleeping is actually not just physically rejuvenating, but it helps to flush out toxins from the brain. It allows us to dream things that would otherwise cause us anxiety, so we kind of deal with them and we get rid of them. And it's actually good for the state of mind of a person, for the emotion of a person, and it's even spiritually worthwhile as well. That Rabbi Hanina has no issue with. He doesn't have an issue with a person who's sleeping at night, because that's appropriate. His question is, what happens if you're ne'or balayla? What happens if you're awake during the night? That's a whole different question. In other words, this is a time where you could have excused yourself and you could have said, look, I'm tired and I need to sleep, and that's why I'm sleeping. But now you're up. If you're up at night, and you use the time when you are awake at night for something that is levatala, that means it has no value, it has no direction, it has no purpose, then you have made yourself vulnerable. That means to say that if Hashem has created a certain time of the day that is more susceptible to danger than other times, and a person places themselves willingly in danger's way. Why? Because you're up during that time and you're doing nothing of value. So it's almost as if to say you don't necessarily deserve protection. That's when a person is mischayev benafshay. That's when a person takes their life in their own hands, because it is a dangerous choice to make. So immediately you got to wonder. Immediately you got to think like this. The Rambam also writes, in addition to the fact that he says you should sleep for 8 hours, and by the way, it's an interesting question to investigate whether or not the Rambam himself slept for 8 hours. He obviously believed in the principle, but there seems to be some evidence to suggest that he himself didn't necessarily sleep so much. Why? Because the Rambam writes in Moreh HaNevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, that the night hours are the most beautiful hours. Why they're the most beautiful hours? Because nobody can disturb you. Everybody else is sleeping. Think of the Rambam's schedule. He was a person who led a community. He answered all kinds of halachic responsa that were sent to him from around the region. He was a person who put together these incredible books that are the cornerstone of philosophy and Jewish law. He wrote to encourage communities who were going through very, very difficult periods. And he was a physician. Not only that, but for part of his life, he was the royal physician. He had a very busy life. He says the nighttime are the beautiful hours because nobody can disturb you. Therefore, if this is a time that Hashem designed, that you can have less disturbance, naturally then it is a time where you should learn more Torah. That's what the Rambam writes. So he says the nighttime hours are beautiful hours and they should be occupied in study of Torah. That's what Rabbi Hanina tells us. If you're already awake at night, you have every right to sleep. Nobody will fault you for it. But if you have chosen to be up, to be awake at night, then you have chosen to take advantage of Hashem's beautiful hours that He's given you. Time without disturbance. Why did He give you that time? Like the Gemara says, that night was only created in order to facilitate Torah learning. So that's what you've got to do. You've got to learn Torah. And you don't? Instead of learning Torah, instead you direct your heart towards something which is livatala, something which is of no value and of no consequence. That is exactly the scenario by which a person takes their life in their own hands. Because what a chutzpah, what an affront to God. There's actually an expression from our sages where they say that the pasuk which says that a person who disgraces Hashem, say the sages, that refers to a person who has the opportunity to learn Torah and they decide rather not to learn Torah. Now, this is, like I said, not for sensitive viewers, because once upon a time, before the world of electricity and before the world of internet and before the world of DSTV and who knows what else, so what did people do at night? Not much. They pretty much ate, they davened Ma'ariv, they probably learned a little bit Torah, and they went to sleep. They didn't really have too much opportunity to be mefaneh libam levatala, to turn their hearts to something which is meaningless. We, on the other hand, unfortunately, we have these things called screens that steal so much of our time at night, where we, so to speak, pass time, or as some people like to say, it's a terrible expression, they say kill time. That I don't think Rabbi Hanina would approve of at all. My gosh, here you are in the middle of the night when you have this incredible opportunity to be able to learn Torah. And what are you doing? Actually, levatol, you're doing something which is completely meaningless. Now, nighttime in spiritual terms is considered a time of gevura. There are basically two primary energy that Hashem pumps into the world in order for the world to exist. The first energy is the energy called chesed, which is Hashem's benevolence and goodness. And it's because of his benevolence and goodness that we have the ability to live, that we have a world, that we have rain, that we have food, etc., etc. So much so that the verse says, Olam chesed yiboneh, that Hashem created a world out of kindness. However, there's a second energy that Hashem also uses in his world, and that's called the energy of gevura. Gevura is strictness and discipline and high expectation that Hashem has of us. And chesed is generally the daytime energy. That's why we say in Tehillim, Lehagid baboiker chastecha. Hashem, we will declare your chesed, your kindness in the mornings, because daytime is time of chesed. That's when you feel warmth. That's when you see the light of the world. You could see it feels a lot more chesed-like, a lot more benevolent. Nighttime is a period of gevura. Gevura is where Hashem retracts the goodness and the obvious help from the world. So the world starts to go dark and the world starts to go cold as it would do at night. And that's why we say the same pasuk, Lahagid ba'boker chasdecha, that we declare Hashem's kindness in the morning. Ve'emunascha ba'leilos, at night we have to speak about our faith in Hashem because we don't see his kindness. So therefore we have to declare our faith that in spite of the fact that we don't see his kindness, we still believe that Hashem has our best interests at heart. So in that sense, daytime becomes a metaphor for the good times in life, and nighttime becomes a metaphor for the difficult times in life. So if nighttime is already a period of gevura, gevura means where a person is held to a higher level of expectation than, for example, during the day. That's why Rabbi Chanina says, Hanei or balayla, if a person keeps himself awake at night, which is a time that Hashem is a bit stricter than it would be during the day. You can see it because you can see that the world is kind of receded into a dark space. And in that space, a person does not engage with Torah, then the Shekhinah, the divine presence, which would be in a place of Torah. It's also one of the themes of this chapter. We've already seen it before. We're going to see it again. That wherever a person studies Torah, the divine presence is with them. So here's somebody who chooses to be up at night, which is a time of gevura, which is a time of danger. And they choose to waste the time that they're awake, then the Shekhinah leaves them. Because if they had learned Torah, the Shekhinah would be with them. Now that they're not learning Torah, the Shekhinah leaves them. And then the person becomes susceptible, God forbid, to any kind of negativity, negative influence. In fact, that's exactly the same theme that he says when you're walking on the road, because he says when you're walking on the road, we know that that's a dangerous thing. To be traveling between cities is automatically a high-risk activity, automatically, because of the elements that you'll be exposed to and the dangers that you'll be exposed to and so forth. So when a person is in a dangerous environment, they need an escort. And the Torah is called an escort. Torah itself describes itself as this gracious escort of the Jewish people. So when a person is on the street and alone, but they learn Torah, they've got the Torah escorting them. So they've got an element of protection. As just described, they've got the divine presence with them. So that's good. That helps you. That keeps you safe. If the person, however, chooses to go on the road and they don't have the Torah with them, who's the escort? Who's the protection? So it turns out that Rabbi Chanina is effectively telling us one message with two examples. The message is that there are certain scenarios in life where a person is more exposed and requires more assistance, more protection. And the best way to get protection is through Torah learning. So definitely do not opt in those situations not to learn Torah, because in that case you're actually exposing yourself and, God forbid, making yourself, so to speak, susceptible to something that is not healthy. Now it's really interesting, very, very interesting, that he's defined these two things, staying up at night and walking on the road. That these are two times where a person has to be extra cautious to focus and to study. Now, one of the arguments that's put forward by the commentaries is because, as we said about the nighttime, so too when you're on the road. If it's quiet and there's no distraction, that's actually the best time to learn, because nobody can bother you. In fact, some of the commentaries point out that's why he dafka says, "Hamahalech baderech yechidi," if the person walks on the road alone. Why? Because if you're walking with somebody else, it's natural that you all discuss things, you'll chat with the other person. There's two of you, so it's natural that you'll have a conversation. So we can't fault you then for not learning Torah, because you have to be social with the person that you're walking with or traveling with. Whereas if you are alone on the road, then there's nobody to distract you. The only thing that you should do is you should review words of Torah, thoughts of Torah. That's what you should do on the road. You should review thoughts of Torah. Now, of course, he's talking about the pre-technology age. For us today, if you're sitting in your car, it's a whole lot easier. Pop in a CD or download something on a podcast, and there's no reason why you cannot listen to Torah while you're in the car. It's interesting because every single day of our lives, we actually make a commitment to exactly these principles. Every single day, we tell ourselves that we're supposed to learn Torah if we're awake at night or if we're on the road. Where do we say that? In the Shema. What do we say in the Shema? That you should teach these words to your children. V'dibarta bam, and you should speak in the words of Torah when? When you're sitting at home, and when you walk on the road. So there you go, Rabbi Hanina didn't make this up. It's clear in the Shema that you're required to learn Torah when you're on a journey. And at the time that you go to sleep and at the time that you wake up. So when you wake up, it makes sense. Obviously, you wake up, you're supposed to learn Torah. Now you're awake. What does it mean when you go to sleep? Rabbi Hanina got this also from the Shema. If it's time to go to sleep and you're not going to sleep and instead you're awake, then you have a requirement to share words of Torah. And if a person does not share words of Torah, well, then as we've just seen, the person exposes themselves, God forbid, to danger. Now, it's really interesting because, okay, I get it. If it's a quiet time and you're alone, it's the best time to study undisturbed. And of course you have to prepare for that, because while at night you could wake up and you could pull out a book and you could read, if you're on the road, it's not so simple. If you haven't prepared something, it's unlikely that you'll have something to learn. So obviously you have to prepare. Either you'll have to have committed something to memory, or you'll have to have a recording that you could listen to, or whatever the case is. However, there's one practical question that we have to ask. You see, the previous Mishnah told us, Rabbi Shimon taught, that when you sit at the table and you're eating a meal, even then you should share words of Torah. And of course he was very careful about it, that you shouldn't talk while you have food in your mouth, because that's dangerous. And the Torah is very strict about not doing anything which, God forbid, could harm your health. But the concept of of sharing Torah while you eat, it's, so to speak, unusual. You have to learn how to do it. It's not something which comes naturally to us. So you can train yourself, but it doesn't sound like a radical expectation. When you're on the road, though, maybe it is a radical expectation. Why? Well, look, we've already defined that if a person's on a long-distance journey, there are all kinds of hazards that they have to be aware of. So you've got to watch the road to make sure that you don't fall into a pothole in those days. Today, it's that you don't drive into a pothole. You have to make sure that you don't get, that you're aware of your surroundings, so that, God forbid, if there's a wild animal in the vicinity, you know how to protect yourself, which in today's world would mean you have to watch the road, and you have to make sure that, if some other Meshuggah driver is coming in the other direction, you know what to do about it. And perhaps you get to a crossroads and you have to know which way to go. We've all had the experience, I'm sure, of heading out on a quick errand where we were supposed to go to one place, we didn't pay attention, and instead of going to where we were meant to go, we'd end up going to where we always go, like the school we always collect our children from, or wherever it is. So you have to actually pay attention to the road. So when you're sitting and eating, and how we expect that you're going to share words of Torah, okay, not a big deal. Okay, I'll eat a little bit, then I'll pause and I'll share some Torah and I'll eat some more. But when I'm on the road, when I'm traveling, it's quite an expectation that I should, while I'm trying to keep focus on my surroundings, on the direction that I have to go, and the speed, or whatever, all these things, you expect me to learn Torah then as well? And that's exactly the point. As I mentioned right at the beginning, Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai were two contemporaries who both went through the same process of dedicating their lives that their full-time profession would be studying Torah. It's just that we see Rabbi Chanina is a little bit more than Rabbi Shimon. He's a little bit more radical about it, even than Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon's expectation of people is when you sit down to a meal and it's not a stressful environment, you definitely should learn words of Torah even at the table. And Rabbi Chanina says even if it is a stressful environment, like on the road, even when it is distracting and there's so many things going on, I still think that our dedication to Torah, he says, should be so absolute, should be so focused that even in those circumstances, we still recall or review Torah, even, so to speak, on the way as we're going, as we're going along, as we're going on the road. Now, it's very interesting because obviously it goes without saying that you could read Rabbi Chanina's teachings as absolutely literal. Literally, if you're awake at night, don't waste your time. Do something meaningful. Literally, if you're on the road and it's a long distance journey, prepare yourself so you can have something meaningful to accompany you. Those are so practical. At the same time, you can understand that these are also symbolic messages. Walking a path alone is highly symbolic. And waking up at night is also highly symbolic. Now, our lifespan is comparable to the process of a day. Right? Like the Pasuk says in Tehillim, that you kind of are fresh in the morning and you begin to wither in the later afternoon. Or as people might call it, the twilight of somebody's life. So the early years when a person is hale and healthy, those are the daylight hours of a person's life. And when a person begins to age and, God forbid, decline, that's considered already the nighttime period of a person's life. So what does Rabbi Chanina say? Hanei or balayla. A person who only wakes up when life starts to get dark. A person who only wakes up in their advanced years. And now you want to do something with your life. Excuse me. Hanei or balayla. A person who doesn't wake up when they're young and energetic, but only when they start to age, and then they say, oops, what's life all about? That, he says, is somebody who takes their life in their own hands. In other words, one of the things Judaism expects of us is that we should be people who see ahead. We don't wait for things to happen before we respond to them. We're supposed to read into the future, anticipate what's going to happen. So don't wait until things start to make you question what life is all about. A person should wake up and get involved and engaged in the Jewish experience earlier in life. I suppose by extension you could say a person who only wakes up in the difficult times and only then wants to have a connection to Hashem, same kind of concept, in the nighttime hours, such a person takes their life in their own hands. And then he says, if a person walks a path alone. Now there are two ways to understand what that means. Because walking a path, it's very important. In Judaism, it's really important that we don't remain static. That we're always walking a path. That we're always looking to progress and to advance ourselves, to upgrade ourselves, to grow ourselves. It's a critical part of being Jewish. There's only one thing you have to be really careful about, and that is don't walk a path alone. What does that mean? Two things. Almost on two opposite ends of the spectrum, but two very powerful lessons nonetheless. One way that a person walks a path alone is the person who thinks, I've got this. I don't need a chevra, I don't need a crowd around me, I don't need other people, I don't need a community. I think over the last year with the coronavirus, people have realized how much we need a community. But some people believe that they can go it alone. I'm good. I know how to learn. I know how to do things. I'm very religious. I'm very smart. I can go it alone. A person who believes that they're going to be able to take a path in Judaism, and that path is going to be yours alone without the support of community, without the guidance and direction of leadership, without having what we call chavrusa, as the Gemara says, oy chavrusa, oy misusa. Either you have those that you can connect with in a meaningful way, or it's better not to live at all. So maybe spiritually it means oy chavrusa, oy misusa. Either a person is connected to the community or they are in a state of spiritual decline. The Rambam writes this very clearly. He says, if a person is poiresh min hatzibur, if a person separates themselves from the community, they will never be able to achieve their spiritual objectives, and they will never be able to do teshuvah. Because there's a great element of community that helps us to achieve whatever it is that we are supposed to achieve as Jewish people. So a person who takes a path of Judaism that is of their own device, their own understanding, their own ideas, their own priorities, such a person becomes responsible for having exposed themselves, God forbid, to something dangerous. On the one end of the spectrum. And on the other end of the spectrum, means if a person takes a path in their life where it's all about me. This path is for my interest. I want to become more spiritual. I want to become more learned. I want to become more religious, whatever particular term it is that I put into that sentence. If a person believes that the whole goal of Judaism is my individual success and my individual growth, such a person takes their life in their own hands. Because a fundamental principle of Judaism is that Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'zeh, that the whole Jewish community is responsible for each other, and there's no person who can claim to be a spiritual island, and there is actually no way that a person can further their own spirituality to the exclusion of others. So if you're not looking out for other people, and if you're not trying not only to assist people physically, to give tzedakah and to show Ahavas Yisrael, love for your fellow Jew, etc., but if you're not actually looking out to engage other people spiritually, and you're just on your derech yechidi, your path that just simply looks to satisfy self, that only looks to make me into a person who I believe is going to be so spectacular, such a person takes their life in their own hands. And the reason really is like this. The reason is that Torah is considered the source of all life. Torah is considered the tree of life to all who hold on to it. And so the only way that a person can protect their neshama is only by engaging with Torah. And that's why, if a person directs their mind into meaningless things, so you've cast off the Torah, that person is not holding the tree of life. Likewise, if a person follows a path that is not endorsed by the Torah, like the path of a person only looking to protect it and care for themselves, then they've also disconnected from the tree of life. And that's really Rabbi Chanina's message to us. It's really powerful, it's really practical, and it's certainly something we can all apply in our own lives. Okay, here's a question.